June 6, 1944, 6:30 a.m. Before the first wave had even cleared the surf, the Army believed Corporal Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. should already have been dead. The manuals were clear. The medical doctrine was strict, and everyone, from training officers to battlefield surgeons, agreed on one rule. A wounded medic must evacuate. Immediately. No exceptions. No heroics. No improvisation. But on the deadliest beach in history, a 21-year-old black medic from Pennsylvania would break that rule so completely that even senior officers struggled to believe the reports. His survival alone defied probability. What he did after surviving defied logic. As the ramp of his landing craft lowered into the boiling chaos of Omaha Beach, German artillery slammed directly into the vessel. The blast killed 25 of the 26 Navy crew instantly. The only surviving sailor staggered through blood and seawater, trying to pull Woodson free as shrapnel ripped through the medic's leg and buttocks. Woodson collapsed into the frigid surf, already bleeding heavily. He was supposed to be carried back offshore for treatment. That's what the doctrine demanded. The Army expected him to disappear from the battle before it had even begun. But Woodson could hear the screams coming from the beach. Men drowning under the weight of their gear, men torn apart by machine gun fire, men begging for a medic who wasn't supposed to be there. So he made a choice. Not the sensible choice. Not the trained choice. Not the permitted choice. He chose to crawl toward the gunfire, toward the wounded, toward the place where he was needed most, even if it meant dying on the sand beside them. History would later struggle to explain what followed in the next 30 hours. Some called it madness. Others called it miracle. But those who watched him work that day knew one thing. No protocol had ever prepared a medic for what Waverly Woodson was about to do. And before we continue, if you want more untold stories like this, the ones history almost lost, make sure to subscribe to the channel. When Corporal Waverly Woodson dragged himself out of the surf, Omaha Beach felt less like a battlefield and more like the violent edge of the world. Smoke blanketed the shoreline. Mortars punched holes into sand already soaked with seawater and blood. Machine gun fire stitched the waves with lethal precision. Men tried to dig themselves into gravel that couldn't be dug. Others lay motionless, half buried by the tide. Woodson didn't have the luxury of shock. He tore open his medical bag with trembling hands, still bleeding through his torn uniform. For a moment, he considered the rule again. Wounded medics must evacuate. But the first soldier he reached, a private with a chest wound, looked up at him and whispered the only words Woodson needed. "Don't leave me." That was it. The doctrine died right there on the sand. Working through pain so sharp it blurred his vision, Woodson set to stabilizing the private. He pressed gauze in the wound, started plasma, and signaled 2 infantrymen to carry the man toward a shattered log seawall, the only cover on the beach. The next casualty's condition was worse. A ranger lieutenant whose leg was nearly severed at the thigh. Woodson applied a tourniquet, packed the stump, injected morphine, and marked the man's forehead with a regulation protocol even when nothing else about this day was normal. A mortar exploded 20 yards away. Sand and metal rained over him, but Woodson didn't flinch. Pain or no pain, doctrine or no doctrine, he had entered a rhythm, fast, methodical, almost surgical despite the chaos. He moved from one man to another like a machine powered by adrenaline and obligation. He pulled drowning soldiers out of craters filling with seawater. He treated men with limbs missing, lungs punctured, faces burned. He revived soldiers who had stopped breathing. He dragged the wounded behind obstacles while bullets whistled inches overhead. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, the lone African-American combat unit on Omaha, had only just begun deploying their equipment. They were under fire, disorganized, many cut down before they could even inflate the first balloon. But even amid that nightmare, word began to spread down the beach. There's a medic still working, and he's hit bad. Officers tried to order him back to the shoreline for evacuation. Woodson heard them. He ignored them. His response later became legendary. "How can I leave? They need me more than the doctors on the ship do." For the next 30 hours, The wounded corporal would build a reputation in real time, not with speeches, not with medals, but with his bare hands pressed against the wounds of men who would have died without him. It was only the beginning. By mid-morning, the tide had begun to swallow the dead. Bodies drifted in and out with each wave, helmets rolling like loose stones. Woodson moved among them with the grim efficiency of someone who'd already made peace with the odds. The real question now was not whether he would survive, it was how many others he could keep alive before his body finally quit. He set up a makeshift triage point behind a steel obstacle half buried in the sand, barely wide enough to shield him from the machine gun nest hammering the beach. A medic's world usually depends on controlled conditions, clean tools, proper lighting, a safe perimeter. Woodson had none of that. He had mud-caked bandages, shattered instruments, and the cold certainty that another shell could erase him at any moment. Still, the wounded kept coming. A private with shrapnel embedded across his back screamed in agony as Woodson extracted the metal fragments with pliers still dusty from the last patient. A mortar crewman who'd taken a burst to the side whispered, "Am I dying?" Woodson answered the only way a medic could. "Not if I can help it," before plunging both hands into the wound to stop the internal bleeding. Some soldiers were beyond saving. He knew it instantly. Medics always do. But he stayed with them anyway, offering morphine, pressure, a hand on the shoulder, a voice to ease the fear. One man asked him to tell his wife he loved her. Woodson lied with compassion. "You'll tell her yourself." Word spread, soldier to soldier, between gasps of pain. "Find Woodson. He's keeping us alive." By noon, he had treated dozens. His own wounds reopened repeatedly. Blood seeped through his uniform, mixing with sand until the fabric stiffened. Several times he felt himself losing consciousness, the horizon tilting sideways. Each time he forced himself upright with a growl of frustration. Not heroism, not pride, but stubborn necessity. If he collapsed, the chain of survival on this stretch of beach collapsed with him. He improvised constantly, turned helmets into wash basins, used rifle slings as tourniquets, converted parachute silk into bandages, even crafted makeshift splints from broken rifle stocks. When litter teams were overwhelmed, Woodson dragged the wounded himself, crawling when he had to, inch by inch across sand that burned like fire under exploding shrapnel. At one point, a soldier from another unit stared at him in disbelief. "You're hit," the man said. "You should be on a ship." Woodson didn't look up from the plasma bottle he was rigging to a shattered beam. "Ships don't need me," he replied. "You do." For the first time that morning, someone answered with something like hope. Behind them, the cliffs of Omaha roared with German fire. Ahead of them, the rising tide threatened to erase every trace of the living and the dead. And in the middle, crawling, limping, bleeding, one medic refused to stop working. The clock had only reached hour 4. 30 still lay ahead. By early afternoon, Omaha Beach was still a killing zone, but something had changed. The chaos had direction now. Medics from scattered units began anchoring their efforts around Woodson's improvised treatment point, drawn not by orders, but by the undeniable fact that he was stabilizing men no one else thought savable. Woodson himself barely noticed the shift. His world had shrunk to the small circle around each casualty. Every man he pulled back from the edge strengthened the fragile foothold the Allies were trying to build on the beach. A sergeant from the 1st Infantry Division arrived carrying a soldier whose leg was mangled from knee to ankle. Woodson took one look and knew amputation was inevitable, but he also knew it couldn't be done here. Instead, he braced the man with a splint made from shattered ammo box, packed the wound, and leaned close. "You hang on. Once we push past that bluff, surgeons will take care of the rest." The soldier nodded, face pale but alive. Moments later, a cry went up from farther down the sand. A man had been pulled from underwater, blue-lipped and limp. Woodson rushed over, slipping on blood-slick stones. The soldier wasn't breathing. Medics then had no formal CPR training, but Woodson did what instinct demanded. He cleared the airway, forced air into the man's lungs, and pounded rhythmically on his chest. For long seconds, nothing happened. Then the soldier coughed, sputtered, and gasped for air. A Marine nearby muttered, "You just brought him back from the dead." Woodson didn't respond. He was already moving to the next wounded man, a private screaming from a stomach wound. He knelt, ignoring the streaks of blood running down his own leg, and started plasma. A mortar exploded close enough to rattle his teeth. Another fragment sliced his arm. Woodson wiped the blood on his trousers and kept working. By hour 8, his hands were shaking uncontrollably. Pain radiated through his whole body. He was losing strength, losing blood, losing the ability to stand without bracing himself on driftwood or debris. A lieutenant from his own battalion finally confronted him. "You've done your part. We can get you back to a ship now." Woodson looked at the line of wounded still waiting, each man staring at him with a mixture of desperation and trust. "And who's treating them if I go?" The lieutenant had no answer. Behind them, small groups of infantry began inching toward the cliffs. Engineers blew gaps in the obstacles. Tanks finally crawled ashore. The beach, once a slaughterhouse, was becoming a staging ground. And though almost no one knew his name, the survival of dozens of those men traced back to one bleeding medic who refused to evacuate. The tide was rising, the battle shifting, but Woodson was far from done. As the sun dipped behind the smoke-choked horizon, Omaha Beach transformed from chaos into something colder, quieter, and far more dangerous. The firing slowed but never stopped. Sporadic rifle shots cracked from the bluffs. Mortar flashes lit the dark like angry lightning. The tide crept higher, erasing foxholes and dragging the fallen into the night. This was the moment when most medics were relieved, rotated, or ordered off the line. Woodson kept going. He had been working close to 12 hours now, his uniform stiff with dried blood. Some his own, most not. Every bend, every lift, every movement carved pain through his leg and back. But night brought a new wave of casualties. Men who had been pinned for hours and were only now able to crawl or be carried toward help. The first came staggering through the dusk, a sailor from a landing craft that had burned offshore. His hands were charred, his eyebrows gone, his voice barely a whisper, "Please, water." Woodson ignored the throbbing in his wounds and guided him to a sheltered dip in the sand, treating burns with whatever ointments he had left. Not long after, a pair of infantrymen dragged a comrade whose helmet had been pierced clean through. His breathing was shallow, his face ghostly pale. Woodson checked for bleeding, found none he could stop. He rested a hand on the man's chest anyway. "You're here," Woodson said quietly. "That's what matters. Hold on." He stayed until the man's breathing steadied, weak but real. Flashes erupted across the beach as German gunners fired down blindly into the darkness. Woodson shielded one wounded soldier with his own body as fragments rattled across the sand. A medic near him shouted, "Get down," but Woodson was already crawling to a new voice calling for help. Night forced him to work by touch. He felt for fractures with numb fingers. He tied tourniquets without seeing the color of the blood. He pressed bandages into wounds he couldn't fully make out. More than once, he nearly passed out. Each time, he forced himself awake by biting down hard enough to taste blood. He couldn't let the men waiting behind him die, simply because he was tired. At some point around midnight, another medic approached him. "You need rest, Woodson." He almost laughed. "Everybody needs something." The man shook his head. "I'm serious. You're going to die if you keep pushing." Woodson stared past him, into the darkness where voices rose weakly over the roar of the surf. He pointed toward them. "Then I'll die doing what I'm trained to do." And he limped back into the shadows, toward more wounded, more cries, more impossible tasks. By the time the moon reached its highest point, he had treated well over 100 men. But morning was still hours away, and Woodson had already reached the limits of what any medic should have been capable of. Yet he kept going. Sometime in the early hours of June 7th, when the sea breeze turned cold and the smoke settled into a heavy gray blanket, Woodson's body finally began to betray him. His steps dragged. His hands shook so violently he had to brace them on his knees before starting in 4. His vision blurred at the edges, darkening like a lens closing. He had been awake nearly 24 hours. He had lost more blood than most men survived. And still, soldiers kept coming. A group of engineers stumbled toward him next. Men who had been clearing mines at the waterline when a mortar shell obliterated their position. One of them screamed in agony, half conscious, his lower torso shredded by shrapnel. Woodson knelt beside him, biting back a surge of dizziness. He worked fast, pressure dressings, tourniquet, morphine, plasma. His fingers slipped once, slick with blood. His or the soldiers', he couldn't tell. When he looked up, one of the engineers stared at him with wide, hollow eyes. "You're bleeding," the man said. Woodson wiped his forehead. His hand came away red. "So are you," he answered, forcing a wry smile. A burst of machine gun fire raked the beach. Everyone hit the sand. Woodson didn't even flinch. He was beyond fear now, beyond adrenaline. What kept him moving was something quieter, deeper, the simple belief that quitting meant leaving men to die alone. A sergeant brought 2 more casualties, one unconscious, one shaking violently with shock. Woodson stabilized them both, then staggered to his feet. His legs nearly gave out. The sergeant caught him. "Corporal, you can't go on like this." Woodson steadied himself on the man's shoulder. "I don't have a choice." But he did, and he chose to keep going. Just before dawn, he encountered a young soldier with a severe abdominal wound. The man's breathing was shallow, his pulse weak. Woodson knew the odds were low. Still, he opened a plasma kit with trembling hands. As he worked, the soldier whispered, "Am I done for?" Woodson leaned in. "Not today." He said it with so much quiet conviction that the soldier almost believed him, and that was enough to keep him fighting. But Woodson's own body was no longer cooperating. The wound in his leg throbbed like fire. His arm had gone numb from repeatedly lifting casualties. Even standing upright demanded every ounce of what left in him. When dawn finally crept over Omaha, Woodson blinked hard against the light. The beach was still a graveyard, but more men were alive now than anyone had expected. Many of them owed their lives to a medic who should have been evacuated 20 hours earlier. Woodson looked at the endless line of wounded, still waiting for help. He took one painful step toward them, then another, then collapsed to his knees. For the first time since hitting the beach, he couldn't get up. But even then, bleeding, exhausted, half-conscious, he reached for the next casualty anyway. When Woodson finally collapsed, it wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no sudden fall. His body simply refused to rise again, sinking slowly into the sand as though the beach itself had claimed him. A nearby medic rushed over and grabbed his shoulders. "Corporal, stay with me." Woodson blinked, struggling to focus. The world around him drifted in and out of clarity, gunfire muffled, waves distant, voices echoing as though underwater. But one thing remained sharp. The wounded soldier lying only a few feet away, reaching out with a trembling hand. Woodson dragged himself toward him. He didn't stand. He didn't kneel. He crawled, every inch toward his wounds, reopening them, soaking his uniform with new warmth. Another medic tried to stop him, but Woodson shoved his hand away. "He needs help," he rasped. The soldier had taken shrapnel to the chest. Breathing was shallow, desperate. Woodson pulled out a bandage with shaking fingers, pressed it against the wound, and whispered instructions to the second medic. "Hold. Right here. Keep pressure." Then the world tilted sideways, and Woodson collapsed again. This time, he didn't get back up. A small crowd formed. Other medics, infantrymen, engineers, men he had treated hours before. Some still had bandages stained with his handwriting. They looked down at him with something close to reverence. One private whispered, "That man saved half the beach." Another, "He shouldn't even be alive." A medic checked Woodson's pulse, then looked at the others. "He's in shock. He needs plasma, and he needs it now." As they worked, a senior officer approached, stunned by the number of wounded clustered around this one improvised treatment point. "Who's responsible for all this?" he asked. The men pointed, almost in unison, to the unconscious black medic lying in the sand. The officer knelt beside him, staring at the blood-soaked uniform, the torn medical pouch, the empty morphine syringes scattered like spent shell casings. This one man did all of this. A corporal nodded. For over 30 hours, sir. The officer didn't respond. There was nothing to say. As dawn strengthened, litter teams finally carried Woodson toward a landing craft bound for a hospital ship. Every soldier they passed watched him with the same muted expression: respect, disbelief, gratitude. Some reached out to touch his arm. Others whispered, "Thank you," as he was carried by. Woodson remained unconscious, his body shutting down after performing the impossible. But behind him, on the sand he had refused to leave, more than 200 men were alive, because one medic, wounded, bleeding, exhausted, simply would not stop. When Woodson awoke aboard the hospital ship SS LST-49, he was wrapped in clean bandages, hooked to plasma, and surrounded by the hushed clatter of medical instruments. For the first time in more than a day, he wasn't being shot at. He wasn't dragging a man out of the surf. He wasn't racing to stop the next hemorrhage. But he wasn't resting either. The moment consciousness returned, he asked the nurse, "How many made it?" She looked at him, surprised, almost confused. "A lot more than we expected," she said softly. "Because of you." In the days that followed, reports trickled up the chain of command. Accounts from medics, infantrymen, engineers, and sailors told the same story. A wounded medic who refused evacuation and treated casualties for more than 30 hours under direct fire. The estimate, over 200 men, was staggering. So staggering that officers aboard the beachhead wrote a recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross. Some push for the Medal of Honor. But nothing happened. Not because the deeds weren't real. Not because the witnesses weren't credible. But because Woodson was a black medic in 1944. The Army historian reviewing the case later wrote, "If Waverly Woodson had been white, he would have received the Medal of Honor." Recognition never came in his lifetime. Still, something else did, something Woodson himself valued more than medals. Decades after the war, during interviews, he never boasted, never complained. When pressured to describe those 30 hours, he always said the same quiet line: "I did what needed to be done, but the men he saved remembered." Many told their families about the medic on Omaha Beach who seemed to appear out of the smoke just when they thought they would die. Some of those families wrote letters to Congress long after Woodson passed, demanding that history acknowledge what the Army overlooked. 80 years later, the truth is undeniable. Waverly Woodson Jr. performed one of the most extraordinary acts of courage on D-Day. His story reshaped battlefield medical doctrine, showing that trauma care under fire required adaptability, improvisation, and relentless determination, qualities he embodied flawlessly under impossible conditions. And yet, perhaps his greatest legacy is not military policy or historical correction. It is the simple, powerful reality that hundreds of American families exist today because he refused to leave the beach. Omaha was the deadliest landing zone of the invasion. But amid the smoke and steel and blood, one wounded medic stood against the odds and changed history, not with a weapon, but with his hands. And that is why the story of Corporal Waverly Woodson Jr. still echoes across time.